Thank you for a nice introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to give my first lecture on my my postdoc topic. You already mentioned the working title of my postdoc project is Politics of Ecstasy, a transnational history of the body in Western countercultures, 1960s till 1980s, and today I will present some aspects and facets of this project. And before I want to start, I want to mention that I a little bit changed the focus of my talk. I will not so much look on countercultural politics of ecstasy from the 1960s until the 1980s, but will more focus on the 1960s and early 1970s. And the geographical focus will be the United States, Great Britain, and Western Germany. So before I will start, some other remarks. First, as you probably already realized, my English is very German. So I hope that everybody is able to understand me. If not, or if in case that I will speak too low or too fast, please let me know. The second remark, I'm still very much at the beginning of my postdoc project. So consequently, some parts of my lecture will have more or less the character of work in progress. And I'm not able to describe all the facets and shades of countercultural use of sexuality and psychedelic drugs. And I will focus very much on these countercultural milieus which kind of used psychedelic drugs and liberated sexuality. I use liberated sexuality as a kind of term of sources, so I don't think that there's really kind of real liberation of sexuality or something like that. So I will focus on these milieus which used these techniques to overcome Western capitalism. There were also other factions, for instance, Timothy Leary. You all got a kind of interview in the Playboy of him. He's more kind of representative of a more not so, it's also politicized, but he's more looking for kind of spiritual discovery and uses LSD for this aim. And last remark, I want to briefly, before I begin my talk, I want to briefly describe the term psychedelic drugs, how it was used during the 1960s, 70s. Members of countercultures distinguished between conventional drugs, this were, for instance, alcohol, tobacco, opium, or cocaine, and psychedelic drugs. And under the label psychedelic drugs, they subsumed substances which, in their opinion, could contribute to the expansion of consciousness. For instance, LSD, which was also very often called acid, marijuana or pot, they often referred to these substances as pot, mescaline, peyote, or STP. At the very beginning, I want to shortly introduce you the structure of my lecture. And I will start with presenting a source. Afterwards, I will very briefly outline Western countercultures and their rise. Then I will talk about countercultural notions of the body and will depict how, according to members of countercultures, psychedelic drugs and liberated sexuality would contribute to the replacement of Western capitalist modes of association by solidary and international communities. And at the very end, I have a kind of methodological question, a problem for you I face at the moment, and maybe you can help me a little bit with solving this problem or how I can handle it. So now, after this quite long interlude, I will start. In 1969, a pamphlet titled Bewusstseinserweiternde Drogen, eine Aufforderung zur Diskussion was released with German left-wing publisher Edition Voltaire. Translated into English, the title would be something like Consciousness and Expanding Drugs, a request for discussion. During the following months and years, the book was widely received in Germany, and it was published in several editions and pirate editions. More than 10,000 copies were sold in 1970 alone. Since there exists no English translation of the book, I will translate the quotes, or I translated the quotes I will present in the following from German into English. Convinced of the necessity to link, quote, emancipatory consciousness-expanding practices, end of quote, to political theory, its author, Ronald Steckel, pleads on 150 pages for the use of psychedelic drugs. According to Steckel, substances like LSD or mescaline and so on could be useful in manifold ways for creating a countercultural self. As biochemical tools, that was a quote of him, as biochemical tools, they would enable human beings to overcome the, quote, ironclad and neurotic character structure, end of quote, which according to Steckel resulted from capital association. Furthermore, they would make it possible to transcend the personality by expanding the consciousness. And last but not least, the experience of psychedelic drugs would set an end to, quote, the separation between body and soul, between reason and emotions, and between public and private existence, end of quote, which he also describes as a result of the capitalist modes of production. In sum, Steckel construed a theory of overcoming capitalist association in which politics and practices of ecstasy were central. Doing so, he intensively discusses the developments of and processes in countercultural milieus in the United States and refers to persons who exerted great influence on different countercultural groups and factions in the United States. So he refers, for instance, to Timothy Leary, which was kind of so-called prophet of LSD, to Jerry Rubin or Abby Hoffman, who were both leading persons in the Youth International Party. It was a very, quite small, but vociferous and attention-getting political group or party, also called Yippies. However, for Steckel, the use of psychedelic substances was not the only subversive body practice to which he ascribed a great significance for the project of overcoming capitalist modes of production and association. Rather, he conceptualized the liberation of sexuality, or liberated sexuality, as a second field of countercultural body politics, which should enable human beings to change and transform their own self, and extension contribute to the overcoming of social conditions perceived as ossified. Steckel's notion of ecstatic bodies as actors of societal transformations evoke questions like the following, and I will try to answer the question during my lecture. So, how could these politics of ecstasy, according to members of countercultural milieus, contribute to changes in Western societies? In which way did they relate the use of psychedelic drugs and the liberation of sexuality to each other? How did the politics of ecstasy conduce the shaping and tightening of transnational networks between countercultures of different countries? In order to be able to answer these questions, some aspects have to be clarified. At first, we need to pin down the milieus to which I refer as countercultures, and then we need to analyze countercultural notions of the relation between the body, the mind, and the self, which are fundamental for the understanding of the politics of ecstasy. Since the 1950s, and especially since the 1960s, a rapidly growing number of often young people got disaffected with contemporary societal conditions in Western industrialized countries. Material affluence, the spread of consumer culture, the continuing racism directed against African Americans, as well as the conservative and oppressive Cold War culture, caused or intensified a sentiment of discontentment and alienation in different social groups in the United States and other Western countries. In addition, the war in Vietnam, its brutality, as well as the representation of these atrocities in mass media, caused millions of people to strive for social, economic, and cultural changes and brought them into at least partial opposition towards the government and the existing societal conditions. In consequence, left and far left organizations, for instance, the SDS in the United States, so SDS is the abbreviation for Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS in Germany, which means Sozialistischer Deutscher Studentenbund, which in English would be Socialist German Student League or something like that, gained a significant rise in membership, influence, and visibility. Although the members of different organizations and movements were united in their general discontentment with the politics of their governments, they were split, as you probably know of the leftist, they were split into varying factions, which advocated diverging worldviews and varying notions of how to oppose and resist the government's politics. Among others, one important distinction between the group was related to the different ideas of how to change and transform society. Whereas some strived for a political revolution, others tried to reconfigure society by means of a cultural revolution. Although it is more or less impossible to draw a clear line between these two camps, I think it is helpful for the understanding of the body politics of ecstasy to make use of this simplifying distinction. That means to draw a line between the camp who advocates political revolution and the other camp who advocates a cultural revolution. All the different groups which in one or another way looked for a cultural revolution are subsumed in my talk under the labor counterculture. Some of them tried to set an end to Western capitalist modes of association by creating solidary communities. Others, as I already mentioned at the beginning, primarily aimed at overcoming an alleged, quote, vacuum in spirituality, end of quote, in Western societies. However, all the different countercultural groups and tendencies were united in the idea that the problems of Western societies are based in the hegemonic cultural conditions. Or to put it in the words of the historians Peter Brownstein and Michael William Doyle, so I will always show you the longer quotes. For the sake of taxonomy, those who were subsumed belatedly by others under the label of counterculture generally understood the crisis that befell not just the American nation, but evidently all the industrialized West as emanating from our common culture. The state was erected on the platform of culture, not vice versa, as a vulgar Marxist might argue, end of quote. Analogous to the more conventional political factions of the New Left, these countercultures were transnational in multiple ways. And in their analysis of society, for instance, an anthology of Joseph Burke shows a drawing with the slogan, I have to switch a little bit, with the slogan, "Frontiers are repression." Then they were also transnational in their self-conceptions and in their practices of daily life. Interpreting the social conditions of Western society as, quote, interrelated and interlocked by a web, a network of shared social, economic, and political practices, end of quote, the countercultures were themselves integrated into a closely intertwined transnational web within which knowledge and experiences circulated. Via the extensive networks of the alternative press, the scientific exchange on conferences and gatherings, contacts in daily life, or in the context of the long journeys that led great numbers of alternatives primarily to the East, so a great number of them moved to India, but also to other places. So to the East, by traveling the Hippie Trail, members of countercultures shared experiences, learned from each other, and interacted in shaping and framing their worldviews, their visions of life, their practices, and their constructions of identity. Consequently, members of countercultures understood themselves as being part of an international community, which for some would evolve within the Western nations, or they described the countercultural movements as characterized by, unquote, international equisexual tribal nomadic lifestyle, end of quote. Other contemporaries were talking about countercultures at the International of Dropouts. In this global process, US counterculture functioned as a primary driving force. Rooted in the urban communities of the beatniks and bohemians, US counterculture spread slowly during the first half of the 1960s, and expanded rapidly since 1967. During the second half of the 1960s, strongly influenced by the experience made by alternatives in the US, countercultures emerged in other Western countries. Until the early 1980s, these alternative cultures exerted a significant efficacy. Now, after having sketched Western countercultures and their international character, I will shortly introduce countercultural notions of the relation between the body, the mind, and the self. The vision of an international cultural revolution was accompanied by a politics of the self which distinguishes the countercultural milieus from the advocates of a political revolution. On the one hand, the proponents of a political revolution were convinced that the self is determined by the modes of production and consequently would not change until after the revolution. On the other hand, the advocates of a cultural revolution believed that a basic reconfiguration of the self would cause a fundamental transformation of society. Thus, in contrast to the advocates of the idea of a political revolution, the proponents of a cultural revolution conceived this change of the self as a technique which would pave the way for societal change. This idea becomes clear in an article titled "Revolution by Lifestyle," which includes, among others, the following quote of Abby Hoffman. So Abby Hoffman I already mentioned before. Quote, "Come on and help build and defend the society you want. Stop trying to organize everybody but yourself. Begin to live your vision. Or one might say, make the revolution by living it. If we do, there's a great payoff. Once we win, we won't have to worry about somebody having perverted the revolution, because the revolution will be us." End of quote. To conceive the role which the body politics of ecstasy played in the project of cultural revolution, it is illuminating to shed light to the way how members of countercultural milieus constructed the relation between the self, the body, and the mind. In Western thinking, the separation of body and mind was deeply embedded and probably still is. Very often, this idea has also influenced the historiography on the psychedelic revolution and the sexual revolution. For instance, historian Andrew de Groot wrote in his book The 60s Unplugged that, quote, "LSD was a benign form of revolution which did not necessitate shooting people. Liberation could come entirely through the mind." End of quote. Another example is Russell Duncan's examination of the countercultural politics of ecstasy, in which he relates the sexual revolution to the sphere of the body and the use of psychedelic drugs to the mind, and therefore draws a clear line between both of them. However, in my opinion, it is problematic and by tendency ahistorical to apply the body-mind separation on countercultural politics of ecstasy, because countercultural understandings of the self are characterized by the rejection of the separation of body and mind. Instead, counterculturists constructed a close interwovenness between both. For instance, members of an international theater group, so a countercultural international theater group, reported of a body experiment they conducted to change the set of attitudes and to resolve the emotion of jealousy of one of its members. This antagonism towards the body-mind dichotomy becomes most explicit in an article titled Revolte, or in English it would be Revolt, written by Michael McClure. McClure was a famous poet and author of the Beat Generation, who was widely received in countercultural milieus, both in the United States and abroad. For instance, the article Revolt was reprinted in a German anthology titled Acid, Neue Amerikanische Szene. In English it would be Acid, New American Scene. And between 1969 and 1981, 15 editions of this book were released, and with a total number of 100,000 copies. I don't know what happened. Oh, not such a big problem, thanks. In this article, McClure develops a fundamentally biologized notion of social revolt, which he based on the assumption that the body and the mind are non-separable. He describes the mind as a function of the body. Quote, "Desires and emotions are, like words, physical parts of the body." End of quote. The supposed interconnectedness of mind and body also influenced the notions of highs, which means the condition of being high, or as I said, stoned or whatever, freaked out, and so on. This becomes clear in an article about the ecstatic effects of rock music written by the countercultural poet and author Chester Anderson, which was also included in the German anthology I just mentioned before. In the following, I will quote a quite long passage of the article, which I think is quite illuminating in regard to the relation of ecstasy, body, and mind. So, quote, "A steady bass line and scales induces something like confidence and or well-being. Rhythms, meanwhile, affect the heart, skeletal muscles, and motor nerves, and can be used to play games with these pretty much at will. Repeated patterns, ostinato, and drones induce an almost instant light hypnosis, just like grass, locking the mind on the music at hand and intensifying all the other reactions. And this is only the beginning, the barest outline of our physical response to music, but data enough for me to make my point. An arranger-composer who knew all this, especially if he had electronic instruments to work with, could play a listener's body like a soft guitar. He could score the listener's body as part of the arrangement, creating an intensity of participation many people don't even achieve in sex." End of quote. Thus, at least according to Chester Anderson, the perception of ecstatic states of the self are very much based on physical processes, which in this case are caused by certain components of rock music. So, after I've sketched the term counterculture and countercultural notions of the body, let's come now back to the questions I asked very much at the beginning of my lecture, and I want to repeat them very shortly, and want to ask them in the following. How could the politics of ecstasy, according to members of countercultural milieus, contribute to changes in Western society? In which way did they relate the use of psychedelic drugs and the sexual liberation to each other? How did the politics of ecstasy contribute to the shaping and tightening of transnational networks between countercultures of different countries? Due to the widespread notion of an indissoluble interwovenness between the body and the mind, the body as well as body practices were highly politicized in countercultural milieus. In a certain way, members of countercultures conceived bodies as territories of political conflicts and power struggles. They constructed a reciprocal relationship between the body and society and assumed that societal conditions and societal transformations would materialize in the body and vice versa. Consequently, they conceived capitalism as a system leaving imprints in human bodies. For instance, Joseph Burke wrote in an article titled "The Creation of an Alternative Society" about the relationship between Western capitalism, the body, and the self. Quote, "Citizens of the United States may have achieved the highest standards of material living or not, but they have achieved the lowest quality of human life. The net effect is a massive self-destruction, explosive, barely controlled, internalized in our bodies, which in desperation is projected around the rest of the world." End of quote. However, the relationship between societal conditions, the body, and the self were not understood as a one-way street in which the societal conditions shape the bodies. Rather, agency was also ascribed to the latter. Thus, bodies were conceived as forces which influence the shape and configuration of societies. Consequently, the body was a means to redress existing social, cultural, or economic conditions and to create a solidary society. In addition to the clothing, the hair, or the body language, for instance, historian William Rorabaugh has wrote about these kind of part of the Cultural Revolution. Body politics of ecstasy played a crucial role in the project of transforming the self and society. In this context, dance and music, especially as we have seen rock music, psychedelic drugs, and an orgastic liberated sexuality were of outstanding importance. Very often, these three body practices were closely connected to each other. For instance, Richard Neville, who was the editor of the famous British countercultural magazine Oz, and who was also the author of the book Play Power, you all get a very short passage of the book, wrote, quote, "Acid rock was flower power's jingle. All the relevant sounds seemed somehow associated with acid and universal love," end of quote. More or less disregarding music and dance today, I will concentrate on highlighting some aspects of the sexual revolution and the psychedelic revolution. The use of psychedelic drugs was politicized in countercultural milieus in the United States, Great Britain, and Western Germany. During the early and mid-1960s, the use of psychedelic drugs got more and more widespread among young people in the USA. In the following years, this habit spread to Great Britain and reached Western Germany in the late 1960s. However, in Western Germany, the use of psychedelic drugs was never as common as it was in the United States or in Great Britain. One of the reasons for this difference, I assume, at the moment, was that when these substances started to get more popular in some countercultural milieus in Germany, the first wave of psychedelic drugs in the United States and in Great Britain already receded, and the drug-related decline of hippie culture in places like Haight Ashbury caused debates about negative effects of drug use. Just to make sure, I think most of you will probably know it, Haight Ashbury was a neighborhood in San Francisco and pretty much one of the centers of hippie culture in the United States during the second half of the 1960s. Whereas advocates of psychedelic drugs in Germany tried to learn from the developments in the United States and Great Britain, the negative effects of drug use on countercultural milieus in the United States evoked strong general opposition against psychedelic drugs within the German left or leftist milieus. For instance, after the influential German leftist magazine Konkret, which still exists today, had printed some affirmative articles on the use of marijuana and LSD during 1968 and 1969, its attitude towards these substances changed fundamentally, and it held a huge conference with the title Sucht ist Flucht, which would be in English, I think the title in English doesn't work really, would be something like Addiction is Escape, in March 1972 in Hamburg. Nonetheless, or maybe especially because of the delayed arrival and the limited circulation and use of psychedelic drugs in Western Germany, their eventual spread there caused joyous and hopeful reactions in countercultural milieus in Great Britain and the United States. In a report titled Berlin, The Politics of Acid, published in the British magazine The International Times on April 11, 1969, the author wrote about Berlin, quote, "Of course, the real change on the scene here has been the dope revolution. In the last 6 months, everybody has turned on. All the communards are stoned out of their heads, leaving only the straight and unimaginative ideologues to make the speeches. Berlin is alive with heads, dropping acid and STP in cinemas, parks, buses, and this too is a kind of revolution, and an interesting antithesis to America, where pot came first and politics followed." End of quote. Counterculturists understood the spread of psychedelic drugs in Germany as a positive development because, as I already briefly mentioned at the very beginning, they ascribe manifold positive consequences to the use of psychedelic substances. In their notions, besides positive effects like the cure of alcoholism by LSD, or the improvement of concentration, the overcoming of impotence, or the banish of excess fat by the use of marijuana, the most important results were transformations of the self, which were constructed as driving forces for societal change. And before I will describe the different effects ascribed to the use of psychedelic drugs, I want to mention briefly that at least some counterculturists were aware that just taking drugs would not change society. With reference to the rapid expansion of marijuana among mainstream use, and especially among United States soldiers in Vietnam, they reminded that, quote, "the sociological implication of drugs, rock music, sex, and long hair cannot be examined in isolation. Pot is part of a subcultural pattern, and its effect is ultimately contingent upon the environment it's smoked in." End of quote. However, if taken in the right, whatever it exactly is, right environment, they conceived the use of these substances as a technique to resist the adjustment of one's subjectivity to the principles of Western capitalism. For instance, in the view of John Sinclair, who founded the White Panther Party, you probably all know the Black Panther Party, and was kind of an ally of this party. So he founded the White Panther Party in the United States. Mostly it was in Michigan, was active in Michigan. And for him, acid was a tool to move younger people, quote, "from alienation to the total embrace of humankind," end of quote, and thus would lay the ground for a political use movement. Counterculturists in Great Britain, as well as in Germany, who were deeply influenced by the US counterculture, also shared this idea. One phenomenon which members of countercultures perceived as being one of the main reasons for human alienation in capitalism was wage work. They imagined psychedelic drugs as a tool against the impertinences of wage labor and praised psychedelic drugs like marijuana and hashish for relieving work, draining competitive zeal, and encouraging laziness. In this sense, Leslie A. Fiedler, literary critic, described the consumption of hallucinogens as a programmatic confession to an anti-Puritan and hedonistic way of existence, and as, quote, "another strategy in the war against work and time," end of quote. In addition to the anti-labor ethics effects of psychedelic drugs, counterculturists also linked psychedelic drugs to the transcending of national borders. In this sense, the US magazine Marijuana Review wrote in 1967, quote, "the marijuana problem is a cultural civil war in which the traditional moral, ethical, and religious conservative confirmative way clashes with the new dynamic global expanded planetary awareness," end of quote. Thus, countercultural conceived psychedelic drugs as a means to build an international community. Following quote shows, quote, "already the hairy tribes have spiritually abolished their nationality and see themselves as a vast unconscious international conspiracy. Marx's famous rallying cry, 'Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains,' captured the imagination of the international proletariat, but nothing else. Workers did not unite. Instead, they went to war against each other. But this present generation are uniting instinctively, erasing national barriers and losing nothing but their passports." An important factor in the project of forming a global community were the numerous journeys on the Hippie Trail, which often lasted for months, sometimes for years, and which brought the counterculturists to countries like Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Morocco, and so on. In the course of these journeys, members of different countercultural milieus got in contact and thus shaped or tightened a network of exchange and transfer. Psychedelic substances were an essential part of these journeys. For some psychedelic substances even constituted the driving forces for traveling on the Hippie Trail. Quote, "It was LSD that took us to India," end of quote, remembered a woman with a countercultural background. Additionally, on these journeys, the common use of drugs and the experience of getting high together was an important social practice that significantly contributed to the shaping of an international countercultural network. For instance, several hundreds of acid heads met on Christmas Eve in 1968 in Marrakesh at an event which the organizer Otis Cook called First Annual Love-In. On this occasion, counterculturists with different national backgrounds drank acid punch, ate a jam containing cannabis, and freaked out together. Sometimes these contexts resulted in long-lasting connections and in a system of mutual support and help. However, counterculturists understood these journeys not only as an opportunity to meet and live together with other freaks, which is a label for people who took acid. Rather, they conceived them also as a chance to convert other Westerners who traveled or temporarily worked in the countries of the Hippie Trail. For instance, Richard Neville wrote that it was, quote, "a favorite game of travelers to turn on a Peace Corps man," end of quote, who later on would spread the newly infused attitudes among other people after his return to the United States. In the process of conversion, drugs also played a significant role. In addition to the impact of drugs on the project of shaping an international community and the impact on the creation of a non-capitalist self, members of countercultural milieus also linked psychedelic drugs closely to the intended so-called liberation of sexuality. Just two pictures which can think pretty clear, make clear the close connection between psychedelic drugs and the liberation of sexuality. So contemporaries understood psychedelic substances as aphrodisiacs, which would drastically intensify sexual pleasures. In an article titled "Hashish, Tibet is überall," which we translated into English, "Hashish, Tibet is everywhere," which was published, the article was published in the German magazine Der Spiegel in 1969, a 25-year-old woman from Berlin talked to the reporter about the influence of hash on her sex life. She stated that sex under the influence of hash was much better than without, since then her skin would be much more sensitive and reactive. Even more than marijuana or hashish, LSD had the image of being a powerful tool to improve the sex life. This becomes most clear in an interview with the so-called LSD prophet Timothy Leary, published in an issue of the magazine Playboy in September 1966. In this interview, the effects of acid on sexuality play an important role. Assuming that LSD would release, quote, an enormous amount of energy from every fiber of your body, most especially including sexual energy, end of quote, Leary concludes that, quote, LSD is the most powerful aphrodisiac ever discovered by man, end of quote. And he claims that, quote, in a carefully prepared loving LSD session, a woman will inevitably have several hundred orgasms. Well, I think that's pretty much more his male fantasy, but okay. Furthermore, according to Leary, the use of LSD also contributed to the degenitalization of sexuality by the cessation, electrification of the sense of touch. As he claims, he had soft orgasms in 100,000 cells when his wife touched his hand during he was tripping on acid. Thus, Leary imagined acid as a means to fundamentally change the experiencing of sexuality. Nevertheless, since he also prayed LSD as a cure for homosexuality, he at the same time reproduced one of the fundaments of Western sexual order, which was and still is heteronormativity. However, for other people of the psychedelic movement, the effects of drug-induced transformations of sexuality followed a different track. For example, the author and film critic Parker Tyler praised psychedelic drugs for contributing to the rise of a, quote, hetero-homosexual promiscuity, end of quote. Thus, according to advocates of psychedelic drugs, LSD contributed to the overcoming of at least some of the conservative morals and patterns of sexuality which counterculturists despised so much, and which they influenced among others by Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse, linked closely to the existing societal conditions they fought against. Therefore, the use of psychedelic drugs was imagined as strengthening the sexual revolution. The second kind of body politics of ecstasy I want to look on today, and which counterculturalists conceived as a means to transform the self and an extension of the society. Just to make clear, the transformation of sexual morals did not start with the rise of the countercultural milieus. Rather, changes in the attitudes towards sexuality already took place before the countercultural sexual revolution. As historian Dagmar Herzog has shown, after a period of sexual conservatism in the years immediately after World War II, attitudes towards sexuality started to change during the 1950s and 1960s. Thus, according to Herzog, these 2 decades can be understood as an era of transition towards more sexual liberality. Among others, this process of liberalization manifested itself in the sexualization of advertisements and in a rapid expansion of the porno and erotic industries. However, counterculturists' attitudes toward this mainstream sexual revolution were negative. For instance, Richard Neville wrote, "Every spring, the press promotes its sexual revolution. On cue, as a premeditated interlude from the serious things of life, it manifests itself in bolder advertisements, franker films, dirtier books, and giddy profusion of bum and tit magazines, outrageous clothes, and theatrical free-for-alls. This sexual revolution has been running for as long as I can remember, but in celebrated permissiveness, which flows fulsomely enough onto the TV screens, seems rarely to spill over into the living room." According to Neville, superficial entertainment and economic interests were the driving forces of the bourgeois sexual revolution, and not the so-called liberation of sexuality. Drawing on thinkers like Wilhelm Reich or Herbert Marcuse, counterculturists understood Western capitalist societies as firmly based on the repression of sexuality. So, for instance, if you think on the book of Wilhelm Reich, Mass Psychology of Fascism, where he links kind of the rise of German fascism to the repression of sexuality, that's very much an inspiration for counterculturists. Thus, the counterculturists constructed a close connection between repressed sexuality and societal conditions which they perceived as being fascist and imperialistic. For instance, the famous Berlin Kommune 1, which would be Kommune 1, demanded in a leaflet with an ironic undertone that policemen should have to work only 35 hours per week, so they will have a spare time, quote, for venting their aggression and making love, end of quote. Against the backdrop of this close linkage between sexuality and society, they described the liberation of sexuality as another body practice to contribute to fundamental societal changes. First, they draw on sexuality as a technique of communication, both with the media and with the police or other representatives of the state. For instance, they understood nudity as a tactic that would produce media's attention and that would discourage arrest. Second, and I think more important for my topic, the liberation of sexuality was understood as a means which via its effects on the body, would transform the self and the society. Analogous to the conceptualization of psychedelic drugs as a means to resist the entrenchment of capitalist values into the self, sexuality was also understood as a tool to liberate human subjectivities from adjustment and adaptation to capitalist ethics. Quote, if we were able to hold on to sex and were gratified by sex and the physical pleasures of sex, and we were free in our sexual joy, we would not have to hold on to things like money in order to give our bodies a sense of security or a sense of order or a sense of perpetuation. We have that in another area. Of course, in a sexual area, much more physical, much more real, much more practical, and much more necessary. It would liberate us from the need of weighting ourselves down, holding on to all the shit. End of quote. However, although the body politics of sexual liberation were conceived as driving forces to create a solidary and non-violent society, they themselves contributed to the reproduction of social hierarchies. Historians like Dagmar Herzog have already pointed to male dominance and female objectification in the sexual revolution. Other historians like Massimo Perinelli indicated the ambivalent attitudes towards homosexuality. Additionally, it seems to me that countercultural notions of sexuality also influenced the view on the populations of the countries counterculturists got in contact with when traveling the Hippie Trail. For instance, Richard Neville recommended that in case of financial emergency, female travelers could have sex with repressed Muslims to earn money. By doing this, he constructed a contrast between countercultural sexuality, which allegedly was liberated from conservative morals, and the alleged repressed sexuality of Muslims. Therefore, he depicted the latter as backward and in consequence reproduced and translated Western Orientalism into a countercultural framework. So let me come to an end and to the conclusion. As I have shown in the course of my lecture, the project of a cultural revolution was closely related to body politics. The notion that societal conditions are indissoluble, interwoven with states of the body was of great influence, both in countercultural analysis of Western societies as well as in their vision of societal changes and transformations. Thus, bodies constituted a field of political struggle and conflict. As means to reconfigure bodies, the use of psychedelic drugs and the liberation of sexuality were advocated in some countercultural milieus in the United States, Great Britain, and Western Germany, and this especially during the 1960s and the early 1970s. Since counterculturalists rejected the separation between the body and the mind, these body politics aimed at creating a countercultural self and an extension at shaping solidary non-capitalist societies beyond the border of existing nation states. This idea of an international community manifested itself in close transnational networks between countercultural milieus in the United States, Great Britain, and Western Germany, which were shaped, among others, by the alternative press, by exchanges on meetings, scientific conferences, for instance, contacts in daily life, or in the context of their journeys. Thus, members of countercultures shared experiences, learned from each other, and interacted in shaping their worldviews and their daily practices. Despite these manifold contacts, there also existed differences between the countercultural body politics in the three countries I focused on, for instance, that in Germany yeah, as I said, psychedelic drugs were never that widespread as in both of the other countries. However, despite the aspiration for shaping a global solidarity community, members of countercultures reproduced certain existing hierarchies between different groups of human beings, both in their narratives and in their daily practices. Yeah, thank you very much for listening to my lecture. And before we will start the discussion, I will want to very briefly point to, as I already mentioned at the beginning, to a methodological problem I think about at the moment. And it is related to tensions between discourse analytical and praxeological approaches. In my project, I'm very much interested in getting into view countercultural discourses as well as the daily practice. So I want to look at both these levels. However, this is what I think at the moment as a historian, I can only approach these practices via texts which are shaped by certain knowledge systems on which the author of the text draw to make sense of the phenomenon he describes. Wow. It's a little bit confusing, the sentence, sorry for that. Consequently, I fear that although I'm looking for practices, I will only find discourses. If you have any suggestions or comments on how to deal with this problem, I would be very happy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristoff. It's a very interesting talk. The floor is open. Yes, Gadi.
Thank you very much.
Just introduce yourself briefly because Kristoff doesn't know us yet.
I'm another patient in the same department as Avia.
Gadi Al-Ghazi.
I'm a historian. I'm thinking about the way such histories could be written, because partly this is the challenge. One question has to do with the transnational aspect. What do we gain and what do we lose? For example, what do you do with the fact that in the German context, you could quote your favorite philosophers in 1970 and to speak about their hashish experiences, that is Ernst Bloch and Walter Benjamin. It's a bit different in the States, with all due respect to the anarchist and individualist tradition. So this is important, and the question, how do you weave it together, or what do we lose if we don't? The second question has to do with the self. If I see it, the way I see it, the term, the self, did not appear in any of the texts quoted. And it's quite seldom for the self, das Self, to be used in German since the 18th century. So I'm asking myself, what does it do? Is it a replacement for speaking about person, personhood, the I, or whatever? Or is it just because we're so obsessed with the self that we translate their language into our language, which is about the self? And since you asked about experiences, I think that we have some good allies in the critical history of medicine. And I think that Magali Tornai published just 2-3 years ago an interesting book about psychopharmaca and boundaries and concepts of the person, which I think is very much alive to the kind of question that you're interested in.
Yeah, thank you. I think the question in regard to writing, it's a very good one. That's pretty much one of the problems I face at the moment, since the topic at all is very huge. So psychedelic revolution, sexual revolution, and then in different countries how these kind of countercultural milieus interacted with each other. So I think one of the dangers is if you look at transnational contexts and so on, that you get that the differences between the countries, the countercultural milieus in the different countries get out of view. So that is one of the things I try to always keep in mind. And I think the second problem with writing maybe is, and I have to write something since in Germany we have this idea of habilitation, which is we have to write a second book after the Ph.D. thesis. The second problem is, as I mentioned very much at the beginning, you have the use of LSD and so on is embedded in very different settings of thinking. For instance, Timothy Leary, I think, has a very different worldview than, for instance, the anarchists or the people of Kommune 1 in Berlin and so on. And this also kind of make the topic much more larger, and I still have to struggle a little bit to handle it. So yeah, that's kind of a question. I'm not able to answer or to give you a structure of how my book will be written or something like that at the moment. The remark in regard to the self is pretty good. I used it pretty much. I think when we talk about terms, a second problem could be that I argue that there is no separation between mind and body. But if I talk about the physical aspects of taking drugs and so on, I always kind of sometimes draw on the term body or on the term mind, and so I think I, in a certain way, reproduce the thinking, the separation in body and mind. And so maybe I think this the self could be a term to kind of combine these two things. But you're right that probably in the quotes I showed you, the term self is not part of the quotes. And yeah, thank you for your third remark. I will keep it in mind.
Could I just do a brief, not really questions, but just clarifications? I didn't ask you, but just before we go on, why do you go from studying anti-Semitism in Southern America, well, not South America, then South US, into this, so counterculture in the West? Just tell us in a few words, and perhaps just again, you say nothing about interviews, but all those people are still alive. Many of them are alive. Those didn't die of overdose. So basically, couldn't you just ask them?
Yeah. So maybe I will start with the first question. In Germany, we have to choose a second topic. We have to choose a very different topic. So at least I was advised not to take a topic of the same time period, and I wanted to get back from only US history to keep it to a more kind of transnational or global history. And then I looked for kind of topics not related to anti-Semitism, racism, anti-Semitism, or something like that, which are kind of what interests me. And so that was one topic that I find very interesting. And when I kind of looked through some sources, that's probably pretty much kind of thing of interest why I chose the topic. It's nothing. I don't know.
It's nothing common, do you think?
I think in Germany it's quite common to choose a.
These things have something in common as far as you're concerned. The study of anti-Semitism and this.
No, I don't think that it's a common combination to do a study in anti-Semitism and afterwards to do study on sexuality and drugs and countercultures. I don't know, probably not, but yeah. I think there are some lines of connection. For instance, gender is very important for my topic, for both of the topics, and also other things. Emotions are kind of a line of connection between both of the topics. So it's not that completely rupture between both, but yeah. And I think the second question was about why I don't use oral history. And I think it would be very much, first it's a kind of, you have to be very patient, I think, but that is not the main reason. The other reason is that I think you also have these tensions between discourse analysis and oral history. Because if people, when I ask them now, and they talk about their experiences they made 30 years ago, they have different layers of experiences, of discourses. That is not the experiences they made in the 70s. That's the way how talk today about the
copies of postcards, of diaries, of.
Yeah, that's of course that's that's in all.
Unless you interview them, you're not going to get access to those things because they're not published.
Yeah, okay, that would be that's an idea. So postcards and so on, or diaries, travel reports. That's very interesting.
Photographs,
Yeah.
videotapes.
So travel reports, there are a lot of travel reports, or at least quite a great number of travel reports is published during the last years. So there are some travel reports.
Yes. Please introduce yourself and the concept. Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, how do you reconcile between certain commonalities that all of these different countercultures have, right, between Germany and Britain and US? And then also, how do you reconcile between what you find out common to all of them and then the very particular context in which these different countercultures develop, right? I mean, they have very different meaning, and sometimes even the same kind of text that they are reading, we are life and adults, have very particular meaning in different countries. Especially after you mentioned Dagmar Herzog's role. I mean, if you look at the countercultural movement in Germany, it's very much about the Nazi past, right? And they want to claim that they want to use drugs and have free sexuality in order not to be like the Nazis. And you could even like connect it to the question about anti-Semitism, where they think there are countries what they imagine to be Nazi repression of sexuality, but Herzog showed that they weren't actually repressed as they imagined. But they wanted to say, we are not like the Nazis, we drugs, or we are not like Semites, we are the new left.
I thought the Nazis did drugs, did they?
They did different drugs.
Right, that's another question that we would say, they try to reject some kind of imagined repression that they are supposed to be the Nazis, while in fact the Nazis were much more kind of wild, they almost, they had like elements of sexual liberation, and they also used drugs, and there was much more kind of research on that now. So I wonder how you reconcile that. And if you look at counterculture in France, it has to do with colonialism, counterculture in Britain has to do with the political welfare state. So very different kind of meanings to these ideals, trying to be more sexually liberated. It looks like it's the same idea, but it's also have very different meaning in each one of these countries. So I wonder how you reconcile these kind of commonalities, but also local context.
Yeah, also a good question. I think maybe the example of, at least in the United States, the fight against fascism is also very widespread. So the term that they're fighting against fascism is not something like unique in Western Germany, but also so the fight against Nixon or against Reagan was all very often framed in the term of fighting against fascism and so on. So I think there is that. At least that is my impression when I looked through, for example, in Berlin, there was a countercultural newspaper called Agit 883, which is Agit, this is a short abbreviation for agitation, I think, and 883 is just a number. They are not, at least when I said it's my impression, they don't have a really clear they don't really use the term fascist or fascism very clear, but they also use it to, the German counterculture use it to describe the conditions in the United States, the war in Vietnam, and so on. So I think that there are kind of connections, but of course you're right that not using the drugs in Western Germany is not the same as has not the same motivations as taking the drugs in the United States, but nonetheless, I think that there are kind of that there are certain commonalities between these countercultures. First, because they very often draw on each other. So when you think on this phenomenon of alternative press, so counterculturists were obsessed in a certain way with producing newspapers and so on. And they very often refer to each other. So you find in the United States, you find articles from German countercultural magazines reprinted in US countercultures. Much more often it is that articles from the United States are reprinted in Germany, for instance. And they also they kind of visited each other. So
They want each other?
visited each other. For instance, Joseph Burke, who was a British counterculturist, he visited Commune 1. Commune, this is this kind of Berlin Commune, the very famous one. And he wrote a short report about his visit and kind of mentions differences. So he mentioned that he was talking with Rainer Langhans and Kunzelmann about how drugs can be politicized and so on. So it's very obvious that there are kind of networks and an exchange between the different countercultures. But of course, you're right. I have to very keep in mind that I don't tell one story of countercultural drug use and use of sexuality for all three, for the countercultures in all three countries. So, yeah.
If I could, so just another kind of comment, it might be interesting to really look at how this difference, same text or letter you must be writing, what realized was like very much admired in Germany while in the UN because you put under arrest, or even the anti-psychiatry people like Foucault, Albuquerque, right? That was very different in one.
Yeah, but it's just it's just my first impression, or one of my, not my first, but since I'm at the very early stage in the project, I also think that Wilhelm Reich was also very famous in US counterculture. I think that he was put under arrest doesn't say anything about how he was received in US counterculture, but more about how US authorities, or however you would label them, perceived him and decided how to handle with him.
Yes, big Michal. Michal, right? No, sorry. Hi.
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 I know very little, mostly from the U.S. context. I just felt that, and perhaps you want to elaborate on that. You often spoke about LSD acid as means for transformation. From what I know about Leary.
About what?
Leary and the Black Panthers.
Oh, yeah.
So the transformation was, yes, there were sexual aspects, but it was about weaponizing the self, or weaponizing the group. So to clarify, one is, it seems that the focus is very much on individual experience, or individuals, but there's some private aspects to it. So I'm wondering about collective perception of acid as a collectivizing. And the other aspect is violence. So it seems that we got the sexual joy or pleasure or intensification of experience version minus the violence.
I'm not sure. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
No.
I'm not sure whether I understood the first question right. I think when it comes to term of collective effects of LSD, I think that I would argue that when they say that when LSD is a means to transform the self and in extension, it changes society. You always have kind of collective and individual combined together. So it's not that you can make a clear distinction between that. But it's good that you mentioned the Black Panther Party. I think that is very important because when you look at the Black Panther Party, you see another facet of drugs in countercultures, at least if you want to subsume the Black Panther Party under the label of counterculture, because the Black Panther Party, they feared they're not really kind of, at least as far as I know, they were not so much interested in LSD, and they were more or less kind of struggling against at least some drugs. So they had this notion that the US authorities would kind of drug the black movements and so destroy the black communities and so on. So this is another very, I think, interesting facet of these kind of topic or countercultures and drugs, which I didn't mention in my talk. There are some facets I didn't mention. And the second question about violence, I very shortly mentioned that, of course, especially the project of sexual liberation was a very sexist project, or was a sexist project. So I think there you have the term of violence in a certain way. And at least in Germany, when it comes to the movement, the German name was Bewegung 2. Juni, and I think if translated maybe to English would be Movement 2 June. I don't know whether this is the right translation. There was a book released a couple of years ago of one of the members, and it's called Terror and Rausch, something like that would be Terror and Ecstasy. And he's pretty much talking about how these militant factions use drugs and so on. So there is, that would be another point maybe.
Yes, please. Before
I'm interested in the social conditions.
Speak up, please.
In the social conditions for this kind of internal focus, which allows this focus on psychedelic experience. Because, for example, if you take in a way the invention of psychedelic experience in 19th century Europe, in Paris, with cannabis. So on the one hand, there are new substances that arrive from Egypt and other places, like, cannabis. But that definitely is also related to romanticism and some kind of subjectivity that didn't exist earlier. And allowed actually this kind of focus on the self. So what interests me is what happened after the war, beside the chemical innovation that allowed this kind of experience, or this kind of interest and focus on the psychedelic experience of the self.
And also, what made them identify the self always with liberation and pleasure? It's not self-obvious. It's not self-evident. Why?
So in the case of my topic,
you seem to be discovering something. That something seems to be strongly related to pleasure. So that says the self is not a thinking quality. It's not a different type of look at the world. It is first and foremost pleasure, and especially liberation from restraint. But please, yes.
So I'm not sure whether I can answer the question, what changes after the war. I think, so if we look at the kind of developments of these kind of psychedelic movement or something like that, I think it started very much with this kind of beat movement, the beatniks in the United States, and in Europe you have these also very different movements which kind of are inspired by anarchism and so on. And I'm not sure. And the beatniks very much were used these kind of drugs to drop out. I don't know whether maybe I understood your question not the right way. I'm not sure.
There's a longer tradition. People are consuming cannabis, they're consuming opium, they're consuming even absinthe. At certain times, they consume absinthe as a way of liberating their creative energy. What happens?
I think. Okay.
Something happens perhaps in the way the goals of the revolution are being defined. There's always something.
I mean, for example, you don't see descriptions of this kind of internal experiences earlier than the 19th century.
Yeah.
At least not this kind. And there are periods in which the social conditions somehow invite this kind of introspection, and others which not. For example, I don't know. You have, for example, Daddy mentioned Benjamin of people who described this kind of psychedelic experiences before the war, but it was not that common. My question was about the context, the social context.
So I think what it changes to, you mentioned Walter Benjamin. At least my impression right now is that there is a kind of I don't know whether the term is the right one, a kind of democratization of these kind of psychedelic experiences. So it's much more people are kind of getting, can use and make this experience. There's also one description which shows up in a lot of sources that they say, okay, during the Middle Ages or whenever, there were people who kind of made these psychedelic or ecstatic experiences by, for instance, sitting in a monastery or something like that and being very focused on something like that. But they said this were only a very small group of people who could make these experiences. And now with LSD, we are able to kind of democratize this experience, and much more people can make these experiences. And that's why this substance can be used as a substance to transform society, because more people can make these experiences.
It starts with Huxley?
That wasn't declared. That at least is what I found in the sources. This was kind of not. I think Timothy Leary said.
By Huxley's tools of perception, so it starts with masculine and this idea of a continuum between sort of meditative, mystical experiences and drug-related experiences, which are in a way sort of a shortcut. You can do this. You don't have to go, to meditate for 10 years. You can go straight into the oceanic experience. Everything is very Jungian. Isn't there a continuation of those ideas? Does everything start anew in the 60s?
Probably not. As a historian, there are always some kind of continuities. And I think I'm not sure whether Walter Benjamin, I'm not sure at the moment. I think I mix it up. I think he wrote a book about his experiences with hashish, which at least in Germany is called Über Haschisch, would be about hashish. And I'm not sure, but I think that they also kind of referred to him, but I have to keep it in mind. I can't give you a clear answer right now.
Right. Yes, please.
I was just wondering if there was some sort of like homogeneous position of the, let's call it more canonical left, like I think the communist parties in countries like France and Italy towards the use of psychedelic drugs and the revolution. There was some unified position on it, or also official policy of the parties regarding drugs?
I think, for at least in Germany, all the different K groups, so all these very small factions of different communist groups, they kind of were very strongly opposed to taking psychedelic drugs, because they said or argued that if you're taking drugs, you won't make the revolution. So, yeah, that's pretty much. I think that would be, I only can guess, would be the same in France and so on. Yeah.
Is there a counterculture in South America? Tell us.
I'm from Spain. So under Franco was kind of difficult to.
Counterculture in South America only?
No, but there is. I think, my students.
Yes.
Trying to replicate that. I think following France.
Yeah, and also counterculturists were traveling to Latin American countries when they kind of were dropping out and.
Mushrooms.
Yeah.
No, please.
Maybe one of the reasons that this is possible at this time is that these are a bunch of kids that is paying for their tuition. They don't have to worry about going to work tomorrow, so of course they can do LSD. And then comes also all the ideology, which is, I don't underestimate it, but it's physically possible because they are very financially secure. But I wanted to ask a different question. If you think only about the practices or the, let's say, sociological aspect of these groups, hippies or counterculturalists, do you find any similarities with the phenomena of cults, where there's a very charismatic guru and he's liberating all his young male and maybe female followers by being sexually very free, you know? Do you find anything similar with those kinds of actions?
First, your first remark, I think you're completely right. I think material affluence is very important in this context, why it happened during these years. And I think I mentioned very much at the beginning, very shortly, this was also kind of an explanation they gave by themselves. So, yeah, thank you. The second one, whether there was kind of, I would say, structural violence, I don't know how to say it. I think, for instance, in the Kommune 1 in Berlin, that's maybe I put it a little bit too strong, but I think Rainer Kunzelmann and Langhoff and Kunzelmann were kind of stars of this commune. And obviously, I found one description when it was Joseph Berkey visited this commune. He said, okay, Kunzelmann, he talks to me, sometimes he stops fucking the chick, and then he talks to me, and so on. And it's very much kind of what you described, the structure between male and female in regard to sexuality. So, and you also have, I think it was in Austria, there was one huge commune which were kind of a huge scandal a couple of years ago. Otto Mühle was the name of the guy, and it was a kind of scandal of sexual abuse, I think also child abuse and so on, and yeah.
Last question, please.
Thank you. You mentioned Timothy Leary, and I was thinking about his colleague because of your Ramdas. I don't remember his name.
Yeah, Alpert or something
American,
like that.
Richard something.
Yeah.
And he was, I think he's quite an interesting figure because he's regarding both the psychedelic drugs and he's talking a lot about, he's talking from a spiritual point of view, both on LSD and also about sex, but more not to enhance pleasure, but as a tantric aspect from India. And I think this is another aspect of both, to see both sex and LSD as a means to spiritual transformation.
Yeah, that, as I mentioned very much at the beginning, that I will focus in my talk on the kind of more politicized, I would say politicized factions of this psychedelic movement. Of course, you have a very large part of the psychedelic movement is primarily interested in spirituality. So also Timothy Leary talks about, I don't know when you read the, if you read the Playboy interview with him, it's all about kind of realizing and getting connected to your roots and so on. And it's then you have these kind of very strong connections to Hinduism and Buddhism. So yeah, that's very important. But I didn't want to put this also into the lecture, just to keep it more clear and simple. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristoff. Thank you all. We're meeting.